Let me ask you something. If you had to have a conversation in another language right now, not perfectly, just enough to order food, ask for directions, maybe make a friend, could you do it? For most of the world, that's a weird question. Of course they could. But if you grew up in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia, your answer might be different, and that's putting it politely. Here's a number that hurts. In the European Union, nearly half of adults, 47%, can speak English as a foreign or second language. That number has actually gone up 5% since 2012. Meanwhile, survey after survey shows that English-speaking countries consistently lag behind the rest of the developed world when it comes to learning anyone else's language. The stereotype is real. English speakers are, statistically, the least multilingual people on the planet. But here's what nobody talks about. It's not because you're lazy, it's not because your schools are worse, it's because you've been handed a superpower that quietly turned into a crutch, and you probably didn't even notice it happening. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through the data, the collapse of language education in the UK, the enrollment freefall in the US, the motivation problem that nobody wants to admit, and then I'm going to flip the script and tell you why none of this is your fault, and why it might be costing you more than you think. Let's start with the most brutal numbers of all. The United Kingdom loves to think of itself as a global, outward-looking nation. But when you look at the language learning data, the picture is grim. A 2024 report from the Higher Education Policy Institute, or HEPI, described the situation as a deepening crisis. Here's why. Only 2.97% of all A-levels taken in 2024 were in modern foreign languages, or classical subjects, or Welsh. That's less than 3%. Think about that. At the highest level of secondary education, fewer than 1 in 30 students is studying another language. There are now more A-level entries for physical education than for French, German, and classical languages combined. This wasn't a sudden crash. It's been happening for 2 decades. At the GCSE level, language entries have fallen from over 500,000 in the early 2000s to roughly 350,000 in 2024, a drop of nearly 35%. And it's not equal across the country either. The decline is worst in poorer areas. The HEPI report found that pupils in more affluent areas are over 20 percentage points more likely to study a language at GCSE, 69% compared to 46% in less affluent areas. That's not just an educational failure, that's a class divide hardening in real time. At the university level, the situation has become so concerning that many institutions have reportedly considered cutting language degrees or merging departments because of falling student numbers, though specific public announcements are hard to confirm. What is clear is that the pipeline of language learners is shrinking at every level, and this isn't ancient history. The patterns we're seeing today have roots going back decades. The 2006 Eurobarometer survey found that while 56% of Europeans could hold a conversation in a second language, only 38% of Britons could say the same. The UK has quite simply stopped prioritizing language learning, and the consequences are already visible in the workforce, in politics, and in the country's ability to engage with the world on equal footing. Now cross the Atlantic to the United States. The picture is different, but the trend is the same: decline. The US doesn't have a national language policy like many European countries do, but what it does have is a slow-motion collapse in university-level language study. Since its peak in 2009, the percentage of college students enrolled in foreign language courses has fallen by nearly 30% over the last decade and a half. Universities are responding the only way they know how, by cutting back. Some institutions have considered scaling back language majors or reducing course offerings because of low enrollments. Those specific program eliminations are not always publicly detailed. What is undeniable is the downward trend. But here's where it gets interesting. Unlike the UK, the US has a massive and growing population of non-English speakers. In fact, almost 22% of US residents over the age of 5 now speak a language other than English at home, double the share from 4 decades ago. That means the United States is becoming more multilingual, not less. The demand and supply are both present, but the formal education system is failing to meet the opportunity. The typical American student graduates from high school with 2 years of foreign language instruction, most of which they forget within a few years. Compared to their peers in Europe, where many students learn 2 or even 3 languages, American students are simply not learning enough to become functionally multilingual, and this has real consequences. In an increasingly globalized job market, being monolingual is starting to look less like a privilege and more like a weakness. The UK and US get most of the attention, but Canada and Australia face their own challenges. In Canada, the situation is more complicated because of the country's official bilingualism. About a fifth of Canadians speak French as their first language, and many others learn it as a second language. But outside of Quebec, the picture becomes much more uneven. Language programs in English-speaking Canada face similar pressures as they do in the US: declining enrollments, program cuts, and a lack of incentives for students to stick with language learning long enough to gain proficiency. Australia has a similar story. As an island nation with a multicultural population, Australia has every reason to invest in language education. Its nearest neighbors speak Indonesian, Mandarin, and Tagalog, not English. But language enrollment in Australian schools has been dropping for years, with fewer students choosing to study a language beyond the basic introductory levels. What's fascinating is that both Canada and Australia benefit from high levels of immigration, which brings multilingual speakers into the countries. But that doesn't automatically translate into language learning among native-born English speakers. In fact, in some cases, it might actually reduce the urgency to learn, because the country already has people who speak other languages. When it comes to English fluency rates, estimates vary. Some sources suggest that over 95% of the UK population speaks English fluently, with Australia and the US showing similar high percentages, though linguists debate the exact numbers because fluency is hard to measure. What's not debated is that English is the overwhelming majority language in all four countries, and that removes much of the everyday pressure to learn another. All of this leads us to the heart of the problem: motivation. The reason native English speakers don't learn other languages isn't because they're inherently bad at it. It's because the world has made it very, very easy for them to avoid trying. Think about it this way. If you're a teenager in the Netherlands, you know that most movies and TV shows are in English, most scientific papers are published in English, most business deals are conducted in English, and most popular music is in English. You have every reason to learn, and you do. The Netherlands consistently ranks as one of the most proficient non-native English-speaking countries in the world. If you're a teenager in California, the incentive structure is flipped. Everything you consume is already in English. Most of the people you meet speak English. Even when you travel internationally, people in the tourism industry speak English. Why would you spend hundreds of hours learning a language you may never need? That's the language learning paradox of the English speaker. The more dominant your native language becomes on the global stage, the less pressure you feel to learn any other. And the data backs this up. There are over 400 million native English speakers in the world today. But the number of people who speak English as a second language is more than double that, over 1.1 billion people. In fact, only about 25% of all English speakers worldwide are native speakers. The overwhelming majority of English users learned it as an additional language. That means for every native English speaker out there, there are roughly 3 non-native speakers who have put in the work to learn your language. Now, be honest. When was the last time you put the same level of work into learning someone else's? This imbalance creates a skewed kind of global communication. It's not that native English speakers are incapable of learning languages. It's that demand is so heavily tilted in one direction that the majority of the effort falls on everyone else. So the data is clear. Native English speakers lag behind much of the world in language learning. But does it actually matter? I'd argue yes, and not just for economic or travel reasons. There's also a cognitive and personal cost to remaining monolingual. Research has repeatedly shown that learning another language has measurable benefits for your brain. Studies have documented that multilingual individuals often exhibit enhanced executive functions, better attentional control, greater cognitive flexibility, and improved working memory. Bilingual individuals often possess enhanced empathy, problem-solving skills, and critical thinking abilities. Learning another language, more or less, forces you to understand another culture and another way of thinking. That exercise in itself makes you more empathetic. It forces you to step outside your own worldview and see things from someone else's perspective. There's also evidence that language learning positively affects emotional stability and reduces anxiety. When you manage multiple languages, you become more comfortable with ambiguity, more adaptable to new situations, and more resilient in the face of cognitive challenges. In other words, language learning isn't just practical. It's a form of mental exercise that strengthens your brain in ways that carry over into almost every other area of your life. And this is where the irony kicks in. The very ease and comfort that English speakers enjoy, the fact that the world comes to them, may be quietly depriving them of these cognitive benefits. While billions of people are receiving the mental workout of bilingualism, native English speakers risk becoming cognitively less agile simply because they never have to stretch. That's not intended as an insult. It's just an observation based on the data. And it's an observation that should make us pause. So what do we do about all this? Here's the good news. The research on bilingualism also shows that it's never too late to start. You don't need to become fluent, and you certainly don't need to sound exactly like a native speaker. The benefits I just described, the cognitive flexibility, the empathy, the improved memory, start accruing as soon as you seriously begin learning. Even intermediate proficiency has measurable effects on brain function. So if you're a native English speaker and you've never seriously tried learning another language, now is a great time to start. The tools are better than they've ever been. Apps like Duolingo and Memrise have made language learning accessible to anyone with a phone. Online tutors are available for a fraction of what in-person lessons used to cost. And there's a wealth of free content on YouTube, Netflix, and streaming services to help you immerse yourself from wherever you are. But I'd also argue for a broader change. At the policy level, English-speaking countries need to reinvest in language education at all levels, from primary school through university. The decline in enrollment I mentioned earlier isn't inevitable. It's the result of choices that policymakers and educators have made, and those choices can be reversed. Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands have shown that it's possible for a population to be both highly proficient in English and highly proficient in other languages. They've done it through early exposure, consistent curriculum, and a cultural value placed on multilingualism. There's no reason the US, UK, Canada, and Australia couldn't do the same. Finally, I think we need to rethink the way we talk about language learning. Too often it's framed as something difficult, tedious, and only for the academically gifted. That's a myth. Learning a language is a skill like any other. It requires consistent practice, but it's well within reach for almost anyone. The question isn't whether English speakers can learn other languages. The question is whether we're willing to get started. Let me wrap this up. The data is undeniable. Across the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia, native English speakers are far less likely to speak a second language than their peers in continental Europe and much of Asia. Language programs are declining. Enrollment is falling. The global dominance of English has created an incentive structure that makes language learning feel optional rather than essential. But here's the thing I want you to take away from this video. Being an English speaker isn't a weakness, it's a privilege. And like any privilege, it comes with a responsibility, the responsibility not to let it become a crutch. The world is not going to stop speaking English anytime soon, but the world is also not going to stand still. The most successful people in the coming decades will be those who can bridge cultures, understand different ways of thinking, and connect with others on their own terms. Language learning isn't just about grammar and vocabulary, it's about empathy, it's about openness, and it's about humility. So here's my challenge to you. Whether you're watching from London or Los Angeles, Sydney or Toronto, pick one language and commit to learning just a little bit of it this year. Not because you have to, because you can, because it will make your brain sharper and your world bigger, and because millions of people learned your language. The least you can do is return the favor. Now I want to hear from you. Do you speak another language? Did you learn it in school or on your own? Or are you one of the people who wishes they had but never got around to it? Comment below. Tell me your language story. I read every single one. And if you want more deep dives into the weird and wonderful world of language, hit subscribe. I post new videos every couple of weeks, and there's a lot more where this came from. This is Language Uncut. Thanks for listening. And don't let your accent hold you back from learning someone else's sound.